People who have only ever seen me stand still think that standing still is the easiest thing a man can do. They watch me from the far side of the rail at the Karen gate, in my red wool and my bearskin and my white gloves, and they decide that whatever is happening behind my eyes must be very small. A man holding a rifle and a single thought, they think. Wait until the relief comes. Wait until the boots cross the cobbles. That is what they imagine, if they imagine anything at all. I will tell you what is actually happening behind that face, because on the morning I am about to describe, a great many people guessed wrong, and one of them guessed wrong in front of more cameras than I have ever seen pointed at one place. I held my post. That is the whole of what I did, and it was also the hardest and the most complete thing I have ever done. Behind that unmoving face, I can tell you exactly what I was thinking, because I remember every minute of it, and I have had years now to turn it over in the quiet. My name is Edric Vane. I'm a sergeant of the King's Sentinels, and on that morning I had stood the Karen Gate of Aldermont Palace for 11 years. The gate is the oldest in the Kingdom of Caldreath, an iron and stone throat between the public square of Veystrand and the inner court, and the men who hold it are chosen for one quality above all others, which is the capacity to be a wall. Not to look like a wall, to be one. A wall does not argue. A wall does not flinch. A wall does not care whether you love it or hate it or photograph it or lean your weight against it to see if it will give. It simply holds the line it was built to hold, and the weather and the years and the foolishness of men break against it and run off into the gutter, and the wall is still there in the morning. That is the work. I had been good at the work for a long time, and I had reasons to be good at it that none of the people in the square could have known by looking, and that is the part of this story worth telling. The mockery is not the story. There is mockery at the gate most days in small doses, and a sentinel who cannot eat a little mockery before breakfast has chosen the wrong trade. The story is what the mockery was standing on top of, and how little the man who threw it understood about the ground beneath his own feet. It was the second week of a hard winter. The square had been swept of snow, but the cold had teeth, the kind of dry, bright, blue-skied cold that makes the brass of your buttons ache to the touch, and turns the breath of the crowd into a low fog that hangs at waist height and never quite clears. I had taken my post at the change of the morning watch, marched the 12 paces and the turn and the 12 paces back that mark a sentinel's box of ground, and then come to the halt in the present, and settled into the stillness the way a man settles into cold water, all at once, and then not thinking about it again. By mid-morning the square was full. There had been notices in the papers that a man was coming, and the man had brought a crowd the way a fire brings smoke. I did not read the papers, but I had heard the talk in the guardroom because even men sworn to stillness talk over their tea. The man coming was a prizefighter, not a soldier, not a statesman, not anyone with business inside the gate I held. A fighter. He had a record that men recited the way boys recite the names of old kings. So many bouts, so many won, none lost. A string of them ended early and violently, and to great applause. He was, the guardroom agreed, the most famous fighting man in the kingdom, and possibly beyond it, and he was on what they called a tour, which as far as I could tell meant being driven from one crowded place to another so that the crowded places could see him, and the cameras could see the crowded places seeing him. The Karen Gate was on his list because everything that draws a crowd is eventually on every such list. The palace is the most photographed thing in Veystrand. The sentinels are the most photographed men in the palace. A man whose trade is being looked at will always, in the end, come to stand beside the men who are looked at most, so that some of that looking will fall on him. I understood this. I did not resent it. A wall does not resent the rain. He came near 11. I heard him before I saw him, the way you hear a wave before it reaches you, a swell in the noise of the square, a turning of heads, the particular electric murmur a crowd makes when the thing it has been waiting for arrives. Then the press of people at the rail thickened and parted, and he came through it with the ease of a man who has never once in his adult life had to wait for a crowd to make room, because the crowd has always made room first. He was big. I will give him that without grudging it, because it was true and because it mattered later. He was a head taller than most of the men around him and built across the shoulders like a door, and he moved with that loose, rolling, deliberate slowness that very strong men use to tell you they are very strong without saying a word. He wore no coat in that cold, only a thin, dark shirt stretched over all that muscle, and I understood that the missing coat was a kind of speech too. Look. Look how little the cold is to me. He had a face that the cameras clearly loved, broad and handsome and quick to grin, and he was grinning as he came, scattering that grin across the crowd like a man throwing bread to birds. Around him moved his people. There is always a court. A fighter of that size does not travel alone. He travels with a small migrating nation of handlers. A man with a clipboard, a woman speaking into a phone, two large quiet men whose only job was to be large and quiet, a string of others with cameras held up high, and walking a half step behind the fighter's left shoulder, an older man who I noticed because he was the only one in the whole procession who was not looking at the fighter. He was looking at everything else. He was a lean, gray, weathered man of perhaps 60, with a flattened nose and the careful, economical walk of someone whose knees have been asking him hard questions for a decade, and his eyes went over the crowd and the gate and the rooflines the way a certain kind of man's eyes always will, counting exits, weighing ground. I noticed him and then I let him go because he was not my concern. My concern was the line, and the line was being approached. The fighter stopped a few feet from me, just on the public side of the worn stones where the crowd has learned over centuries not to step. He looked me up and down with the frank, appraising, faintly amused expression of a man at a livestock fair. The cameras swung to catch us both in the frame, and I did what I have done 10,000 times. I held. I want to be precise about what holding is, because everyone thinks they know and almost no one does. Holding is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of a great deal of feeling and the decision, renewed continuously, to let none of it reach the surface. A man came and stood too close and looked at me as if I were a thing, and a small hot spark went up somewhere in my chest. The old animal spark, the one that says be seen, be answered. Do not let this stand, and I felt it go up, and I watched it go up, and I did not feed it, and it burned out for want of air, the way every one of them had burned out for 11 years. My eyes stayed forward. My face stayed a face that a sculptor might have made. The rifle stayed at my shoulder. I held. Look at this, the fighter said, to no one and to everyone, in a big, easy-carrying voice built for rooms much larger than this one. Will you look at this fella? Stood there like he's been switched off. A laugh ran through the people at the rail, the obliging laugh a crowd gives a famous man whether or not the thing he said was funny. He took a half step closer and leaned, putting his big handsome face down and across so that it slid into the very edge of my vision, into the place where a man's instinct screams at him to turn and meet the intruder. I did not turn. "Hello," he said, drawing the word out, grinning. "Anybody home? You in there, soldier?" I was very much in there. I was in there thinking that he smelled of cold air and expensive cologne, and faintly of the mint he had been chewing, and that the skin under his left eye had the particular shine of a man who has been hit in that spot many times over many years, and that for all his size, he carried his weight a touch too far back on his heels for a man who had spent his life learning to move. Which told me his trade was the kind of fighting where the other man comes to you, and not the kind where you must go and find him in the dark. I was in there noticing things, the way I have always noticed things, because the noticing is older in me than the stillness is. And the stillness was built on top of it. Straightened up, satisfied, and turned to play to the rail. "Toy soldier," he announced, and spread his arms to invite the crowd in on it. "That's what these are, you know that, toy soldiers. They dress 'em up and stand 'em out front so the tourists have something to take pictures of." He paused for the laugh and got it. "I mean no disrespect, pal." He did not look at me when he said no disrespect. He said it to the cameras, which is where the disrespect was actually being deposited. It's a job. Somebody's got to do it. Stand still all day in the funny hat. Takes a special kind of nothing going on to do that, am I right? There is a thing that happens to a younger man when he is mocked, and it is a kind of narrowing. The world shrinks to the mocker and the heat between you, and you stop being able to see anything else. I had felt that narrowing many times in my life and learned at great cost to refuse it, so I did not narrow. I widened. While the fighter played to the crowd, I let my attention go out across the whole square the way it had been trained to. The long habit of a man who has stood ground that mattered, and I took the morning in. The gray man at the fighter's shoulder, watching me now with a small line between his brows. A child up on a father's shoulders at the back, mittened, bored. The two large, quiet men, bored also, in the way professionals are bored by a thing that is not work. A young woman near the rail who was not laughing, who was looking at me with something that might have been embarrassment on my behalf. The whole human weather of the place. I held all of it lightly in my mind, and I held the line, and the fighter's words ran off me and into the gutter where words like that go. He was not done. Men like that are never done with the first round. The first round only tells them the crowd is theirs to play with. He spent the better part of the next half hour orbiting me. He posed beside me with his fists up, mugging, and the cameras flashed. He pretended to whisper secrets in my ear and reported my supposed answers to the crowd in a high, foolish voice that was meant to be mine. He held a coin up before my eyes and clicked his fingers and pretended to be a stage hypnotist, counting me down from 3, and on *1* he clapped his big hands together a hand's breadth from my face. A real test, that one, the sudden violence of it, the bang of flesh on flesh aimed straight at the flinch reflex that lives in the oldest part of every animal's brain. I did not blink. He stepped back and frowned, the grin slipping for just a moment into something else, something that did not like not getting what it had come for. I knew that look. I had spent a long time studying that look, on harder faces than his, in colder places than this. It is the look of a man who has learned that the world rearranges itself around his will, and who has just discovered an object that will not rearrange. It is a look that can go two ways. In a decent man it goes toward curiosity, even respect. In a man who has been told too long and by too many people that he is exceptional, it goes the other way, toward a kind of insulted fury that wears the mask of a joke. I watched his look go the second way, and I understood that the morning was not going to end where it had started, and a very old, very quiet part of me began, without my permission, to wake up. Here is the thing the fighter did not know, that the gray man at his shoulder was an hour from remembering, that the cameras would carry to half the kingdom by nightfall. 11 years I had stood the Karen gate, but I had not come to the gate as a young man fresh from the depot. I had come to it at 43, gray already at the temples, with a knee that no longer trusted me on stairs and a stack of papers in a drawer that I never opened. After 22 years in a part of the army that does not march in parades and does not appear in the papers, and does not, as a rule, exist in any conversation a sentinel is supposed to have over his tea. I will not catalogue it. That is not the point and never was. I will say only this much, because the story does not work unless you know it the way the gray man knew it. For the last 9 of those 22 years, my trade had not been fighting. My trade had been teaching men to fight, and to stop fighting, and to know with their hands and their hips and their breath the difference between the two. I was, for the better part of a decade, the chief instructor of close combat at a school in the high stone country north of Veystrand that has no sign on its gate, and that the men who pass through it call, with the dark affection soldiers, have for the places that nearly killed them, the redoubt. The men who came to me were already the hardest the kingdom produced. I made them harder, and then, this is the part most people never understand about the trade, I made them gentler, because a hard man with no control is a danger to everyone including himself, and the whole of the art I taught could be put in one sentence. The strength is in the not doing, and the doing, when it comes, is small and exact and over before it has begun. That is what I taught, for 9 years, in a cold stone hall, to men who went out from it to do hard quiet work in hard quiet places. And then a knee and a grief and a long tiredness took me out of it, and rather than leave the colors altogether, I asked for the one posting in the whole army that is built entirely out of the not doing. I asked to stand a gate. The men who knew what I had been found this funny, in the way soldiers find the saddest and truest things funny, and one of them, signing my transfer, said, "Vane wants to spend his retirement doing the hardest half of the job and none of the easy half." He was right. He did not know how right. So when a famous prizefighter stood in the cold square of Vaystrand and called me a toy soldier and clapped his hands in my face to make me jump, he was performing a fight, the only kind he knew, in front of a man who had spent 30 years inside the real thing and had given his life over in the end to the discipline of refusing it. He thought the stillness was emptiness. He had it exactly backward. The stillness was the fullest thing in the square. It was everything I knew, held down by everything I had decided. The gray man knew. I'm sure of it now, though it took him the long way round to be sure of it himself. Twice in that half hour I saw him look at me and then look away and then look back, the way you do at a face on a street that you almost place. He had moved up close behind the fighter's shoulder, and once when the fighter was mid-routine I heard him say low, "Bram, Bram, that's enough now, eh? Let's move on." But the fighter, Bram then, I had a name for him now, did not want to move on. He had found a wall and he had decided, in the way of his kind, that the wall was an insult to him personally, and that he would not leave until he had made it move. "You ever fight, soldier?" he said, swinging back to me, and there was a new edge under the playfulness now, the edge of a man who has decided to escalate. "Real fighting, I mean, not this." He gestured at all of me, the uniform, the rifle, the gate. "You know who I am, course you do. Everybody knows who I am." He leaned in again, closer than before, close enough that I could see the broken vessels in the whites of his eyes. "I'd put you down in about 4 seconds, you know that. Whole funny outfit." 4 seconds, want to find out. I held, but I will be honest with you, because there is no point telling this story if I tell it as a saint. Something in me wanted, with a wanting that was 30 years deep, to answer him. Not to hurt him. The wanting was not to hurt him. I left the wanting to hurt behind a long time ago in the cold stone hall where I learned what hurting actually costs. The wanting was simpler and worse than that. It was the wanting to be seen asterisk, to take this loud certain man and show him, in one quiet motion, exactly how much he did not understand about the thing he had built his whole life on. It is the most dangerous want there is, for a man with my training. A blow struck in anger is a tragedy. But a blow struck to be admired, that is a sin, and I knew it. And I felt the want rise up and I watched it rise and I did not feed it. And after a while it too burned down for want of air and I held. A sentinel may speak in only one circumstance, and it is not provocation. We are permitted, required, in fact, to give a clear verbal warning if a member of the public is about to come into contact with us or to breach the line. There is a form of words for it, old and flat and the same for every man on every gate. I had not yet had to use it that morning. I used it now. Because Bram had drifted a step closer, and his weight had shifted onto the balls of his feet in a way I recognized and did not like. And the form of words exists precisely for the moment before a thing happens rather than after. "Step back from the line, sir," I said. My voice in the cold square sounded strange to me, unused, lower than I remembered. "Do not make contact with the guard." The crowd loved it. It was as if the wall had spoken, a ripple of delight and a fresh storm of cameras. And Bram lit up because I had given him exactly the thing he had been digging for. I had reacted. The wall had a voice and he had pried it loose, and now he had to have the rest of it. His grin came back wide and hungry. "Oh, he talks," he crowed to the rail. "Did everybody he talks? Say something else, soldier. Tell us about your big important guarding." And he reached out, almost lazily, the way you would reach to flick a switch, and he put his open hand flat against my chest and shoved. It was not a hard shove, as shoves go. He did not mean it to put me down. He meant it to rock me, to make me stumble back a half step, to make the wall move so the cameras could see the wall move, and so he could turn to the rail and spread his arms and say, "See." He had done it to 100 men in 100 rooms, and they had all rocked back, because that is what a flat hand to the chest does to a man standing at ease. But I was not standing at ease. I have not stood at ease in the true sense since I was 20 years old, and the body remembers what the man has decided to set down. The hand came in, and my hand was already there to meet it, not in anger, not even quite as a decision, but as the oldest and most thoroughly drilled motion I own, drilled into me 10,000 times and then drilled by me into others 10,000 more. I did not strike him. I want that understood above everything else, because it is the whole of the thing. I did not make a fist. I did not raise the rifle. I shifted my weight a hand's breadth, took his shoving hand at the wrist as it landed, lightly, the way you take a cup someone is passing you, turned it through the small arc that turns a shove into nothing, and brought it down and around so that his own momentum carried him a quarter turn off his line and bent him forward at the waist with his arm folded behind him in a hold that, if I closed my hand by another inch, would have taught him a great deal about pain, and that, because I did not close my hand, taught him nothing at all except that he could not move. It was over before the crowd understood it had begun. One moment the famous man was shoving the toy soldier. The next moment the famous man was bent forward and very still, his cheek near my shoulder, his great arm folded up small behind him, held there by the toy soldier's white-gloved hand with no more apparent effort than if I had been holding a railing. I had not moved my feet from my box of ground. My bearskin had not so much as tilted. To the cameras, I am told, it looked like a magic trick, the big man simply folding, as if the air itself had decided to sit him down. I leaned my head a few inches, the only large motion I made in the whole of it, so that I could speak low enough that it was for him and not for the square. I gave you the warning, I said. I will let you go now, and you will step back over the line. Nod if you understand me. He nodded. I felt the nod through my glove, and I opened my hand and let him go, and I returned my hand to the rifle, and I came back to the present and the stillness, eyes forward, in the time it takes to draw one breath. The whole event, from his hand on my chest to my hand back on my rifle, had taken perhaps 3 seconds. He had promised the crowd he could put me down in 4. The arithmetic was not lost on the men who would later watch it frame by frame. He stumbled back over the line. He was not hurt. I had been very careful in the deepest reflexes of my training to make certain he was not hurt, because a man like that hurt is a danger, and a man like that merely stopped is a lesson. But something had gone out of his face, the way the air goes out of a thing. He stood there, breathing, working his shoulder, staring at me, and the grin was entirely gone now, and what was under it was not anger, which I had expected, but a kind of frightened confusion, the look of a man who has stepped onto a stair that is not there. The cameras, sensing the shape of the morning had changed, had gone very busy and very quiet at once. And it was into that silence that the gray man stepped. He came forward past Bram's shoulder, the lean, weathered man with the flattened nose and the careful knees, and he was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, and on his face was the thing I had watched him reaching for all morning, the almost placing now fully placed, and it had stopped him cold. He came right up to the edge of the worn stones, where the crowd does not step, and he stopped, and he looked at me, at my face, at my hands, at the small economical motion of the hold still hanging in the air where it had happened, and his voice when it came out was not loud at all, but the square had gone so still around us that it carried to the rail and beyond. "That's the Tashin lock," he said. He said it the way a man says a prayer he has not said in years and finds he still knows by heart. Off a flat hand push, catch, turn, fold, and you never moved your feet. He shook his head slowly. There's one man taught it like that. One man in the whole army taught it off the feet like that, so it looks like nothing. His eyes came up to mine and held them, and I held them back, because there was no holding the line any more against this. The line was already crossed by him, gently, the way you cross to greet someone you have not seen in a lifetime. "Sergeant," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Instructor Vane, it's God. It's you, isn't it?" I did not answer. A sentinel does not answer. But I think my eyes answered for me, because the gray man let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something heavier, and he turned to Bram and to the cameras and to the whole frozen square, and he told them. "This man," he said, and he had to stop and start again. "This man was the chief close combat instructor at the redoubt for 9 years. 9 years." He pointed at me, but it was not the fighter's kind of pointing, the kind that makes you a spectacle. It was the kind that makes you a fact. Every operator the kingdom sent into the dark for the better part of a decade learned to use his hands from this man. The men who train you Bram. And here he turned and looked at the fighter with an expression I will not forget, something between pity and a hard old anger. They learned it from him. I learned it from him. I was 22 years old and I thought I was the hardest thing God ever made, just like you do. And this man took me apart with 2 fingers in a cold room and then spent 3 years putting me back together into something useful. And the first thing he ever taught me, the first thing, the gray man's voice was thick now, was that the strength is in the not doing, that any fool can throw a punch, that the whole art is in the man who could and doesn't until he must and then does exactly enough and not 1 ounce more. He gestured at the space where the 3-second lesson had happened. You just got the whole curriculum in 1 move, for free, in front of the world, and he never even raised his voice. The square did not erupt. That is the thing I remember most clearly. There was no roar, no cheer, none of the noise a crowd makes when it gets the spectacle it came for. There was instead a long, strange, swelling quiet, the quiet of several hundred people all at once revising in their minds the thing they had been laughing at, and it was a heavier and a better sound than any cheer. The cameras did not flash anymore. They simply ran, drinking it in. And Bram, the famous man, the undefeated man, the man who could put me down in 4 seconds, stood in the cold with his shoulder aching and his certainty gone out of him, and he looked at me. And for the first time all morning he was not performing. He was just a man who had found out in front of everyone that the ground he stood on was not the ground he thought. He did a thing then that I had not expected, and that has stayed with me. And that is the reason I do not tell this story the way the cameras told it, as the day a guard humiliated a bully. Because he was not humiliated in the end, or not only. He stepped back to the line to the right side of it, and he stood up as straight as his sore shoulder would let him, and he looked at me, and he brought his right hand up slowly, and laid it flat against his own chest over his heart, and he bowed his head. It is the salute fighters give in the ring, the old one, the one from before the cameras, the one a man gives the opponent who has taught him something he could not have learned any other way. He held it for a moment. Then he turned and gathered his silent court around him and walked out of the square, and the crowd parted for him as it had when he came in, but it was a different parting, and he walked through it a different man, or at least a man who had been shown, for 3 seconds in the cold, the door to a different way of being. Whether he ever walked through that door, I do not know. That was not mine to do. Mine was only to hold the line and to open the door and to let him see what was on the other side of it. The walking through is always the other man's. The gray man, his name, I learned later, was Cohen Ardle, and he had been a fine student, one of the finest, all those years ago, lingered a moment after the rest had gone. He stood at the edge of the worn stones and looked at me, an old soldier looking at his old instructor across 30 years and a rail he was too well trained to cross, and his eyes were wet and he was not ashamed of it. He came to attention. He gave me a salute, a proper one, the army's own, crisp despite his bad knees, and held it. And I, who am not permitted to return a salute while at my post, who must hold the present and the stillness no matter what crosses the line of my eyes, I held it. But I will tell you the truth here, where only you can hear it. Behind that unmoving face, I returned that salute with everything I had. A man can salute with his whole heart and never move his hand. I learned that too in the cold stone hall a long time ago. Cohen knew it. He held his salute the regulation 3 counts, and then he brought it down and he nodded once, the nod that says I see you, and I know what it cost, and he turned and followed his fighter out of the square. The relief came at the change of the watch, as it always does. I marched my 12 paces and my turn and my 12 paces, and I handed the gate to the next man, a young sentinel of perhaps 25 who had stood the far post all morning and seen the whole of it, and who looked at me as I came off as though I had grown a foot in the night. I gave him nothing. A wall does not explain itself to the next wall. But I will admit that I marched off the Karen gate that morning with my back a little straighter than the cold alone could account for, and that is a small vanity I have made my peace with. The footage went everywhere, of course. They tell me it has been watched more times than there are people in the kingdom. The papers that I do not read ran it for a week. There were men who wanted to make me into something, a hero, a symbol, a face for recruiting posters, and I declined all of it, because a sentinel who becomes a face is no longer a wall, and the wall was the only thing I had ever wanted to be after the cold stone hall took the rest of it out of me. The colonel sent for me, and I expected a reprimand, because I had laid hands on a member of the public, warning or no warning, and there is paper for that. He read me the regulation in a flat voice and entered the breach in the record, and then he closed the book and looked at me over it for a long moment and said, "Off the record, Tash and lock, was it? Off a flat hand push." And I said nothing, and he almost smiled, and he said, "Note it and let it go," which is the closest thing to a medal a man in my trade is ever likely to get, and is worth more than most medals, and I have kept it. People still ask me, when they learn who I was, why a man with 30 years of knowing how to end a fight would choose to spend his last good years standing still at a gate, taking the mockery of tourists, forbidden to so much as turn his head. They ask it as though the standing still were the waste and the fighting had been the worth. They have it backward, the way the fighter had it backward, the way I myself had it backward when I was young and certain, and the hardest thing God ever made. The fighting was never the worth. Any fool can throw a punch. I have known a great many fools who threw very good ones. The worth was always in the other thing, the thing that has no cameras and no record-breaking string of early stoppages. The worth was in the man who could, and doesn't, who holds the whole storm of what he knows down beneath a still face, who answers 10,000 provocations with 10,000 nothings, and who keeps the one small exact answer in reserve for the once-in-11 years morning when it is truly, finally needed, and then spends it carefully, and not 1 ounce more, and goes back to the stillness with his hand on his rifle and his heart in good order. That is the strength. It was always the strength. I spent 9 years trying to teach it in a cold stone hall, and most of what I taught ran off the hard young men like rain off a wall, and that is all right, because some of it stayed, and one cold winter morning a gray old student of mine stood in a crowded square and said it back to me, word for word, and I knew that the not doing had been, after all, the truest thing I ever did. A toy soldier, he called me. He was right, in a way he could not have known. I'm a thing that stands at a gate so the people have something to look at, and most days nothing happens, and the funny hat keeps the snow off, and the work is to be a wall. But a wall is not nothing. Ask the storm that breaks against it. Ask the man who shoved it just once on a bright cold morning to see if it would move, and learned, in 3 seconds and for the rest of his life, exactly what it is that a wall is made of, and exactly how much it had been holding back, all along, for his sake and not his harm. I held my post. That is the whole of what I did. It was also the hardest and the most complete thing I have ever done, and I would not trade one cold morning of it for every fight I ever won. The footage went everywhere, of course. They tell me it has been watched more times than there are people in the kingdom. The papers that I do not read ran it for a week. There were men who wanted to make me into something, a hero, a symbol, a face for recruiting posters, and I declined all of it, because a sentinel who becomes a face is no longer a wall, and the wall was the only thing I had ever wanted to be after the cold stone hall took the rest of it out of me. The colonel sent for me, and I expected a reprimand because I had laid hands on a member of the public, warning or no warning, and there is paper for that. He read me the regulation in a flat voice and entered the breach in the record, And then he closed the book and looked at me over it for a long moment and said, "Off the record. Tash and lock, was it? Off a flat hand push." And I said nothing, and he almost smiled, and he said, "Noted and let it go," which is the closest thing to a medal a man in my trade is ever likely to get, and is worth more than most medals, and I have kept it. People still ask me, when they learn who I was, why a man with 30 years of knowing how to end a fight would choose to spend his last good years standing still at a gate, taking the mockery of tourists, forbidden to so much as turn his head. They ask it as though the standing still were the waste and the fighting had been the worth. They have it backward, the way the fighter had it backward, the way I myself had it backward when I was young and certain, and the hardest thing God ever made. The fighting was never the worth. Any fool can throw a punch. I have known a great many fools who threw very good ones. The worth was always in the other thing, the thing that has no cameras and no record-breaking string of early stoppages. The worth was in the man who could, and doesn't, who holds the whole storm of what he knows down beneath a still face, who answers 10,000 provocations with 10,000 nothings, and who keeps the one small exact answer in reserve for the once-in-11 years morning when it is truly, finally needed, and then spends it carefully, and not 1 ounce more, and goes back to the stillness with his hand on his rifle and his heart in good order. That is the strength. It was always the strength. I spent 9 years trying to teach it in a cold stone hall, and most of what I taught ran off the hard young men like rain off a wall, and that is all right, because some of it stayed, and one cold winter morning a gray old student of mine stood in a crowded square and said it back to me, word for word, and I knew that the not doing had been, after all, the truest thing I ever did. A toy soldier, he called me. He was right, in a way he could not have known. I am a thing that stands at a gate so the people have something to look at, and most days nothing happens, and the funny hat keeps the snow off, and the work is to be a wall. But a wall is not nothing. Ask the storm that breaks against it. Ask the man who shoved it just once on a bright cold morning to see if it would move, and learned, in 3 seconds and for the rest of his life, exactly what it is that a wall is made of, and exactly how much it had been holding back, all along, for his sake and not his harm. I held my post. That is the whole of what I did. It was also the hardest and the most complete thing I have ever done, and I would not trade one cold morning of it for every fight I ever won.